what happened. I have one other teacher. She's like, her daughter's schedule is like, she began to do it. She's like, so this happened, and I said, coach, and then she's like, it's a blessing. Right. So I thought for those two reasons, I knew about the can't take it personally. Yeah.
Good morning. All right, good. We will get it.
People that were coming over were just thin people. I didn't want to ask them. Then I'm going to garage door open to put in. He was a nice custard guy. So I got him to do it.
Nice.
Yeah. You gotta.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next week I'll probably bring that little wood thing that goes somehow.
Okay.
It was the Heinz and stuff, but I couldn't get it. But my son's coming over this week.
Okay. All
I'm
right.
getting some wood.
Okay.
Yeah, I called the guy up. I said, I'm calling back today. It's about $90 for a cord.
Okay.
That's good, right?
That's pretty good.
Because he'll stack it when he gets there.
Oh, nice. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have my son put this thing up I got from Home Depot to, hold it.
Right.
And it's 8 foot, and the guy said the thing is 8 foot by 4 feet by 16.
Perfect.
I was thinking, how could you know that? Is it all 16?
Right. Yep.
Yep. And they're splitting it.
Right. Yeah.
So, I'm pretty sure I understand if you take the whole thing and I'll bring it. And then if I can't see it all, then I'll charge you as much.
Right. Okay. Cool. Good. Good deal.
This Friday. Looks like Sam is coming today.
Your mom's coming?
I don't know. I haven't talked to her this morning. I was with her all day yesterday. I thought she was doing pretty good, but we did a lot of cooking and putting stuff in the fridge and freezer for her to make life easier this week. So, no, just helping her.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you here on this beautiful morning.
My married name is Mom.
Invite you to find a seat, Caleb. At all. For those who have not joined us in the last few weeks and months, we were going through the story of the Bible, and today we get to Luke. And as you'll find out here in a bit, it's about faithfulness and redemption. And so our songs are praising a God who has been faithful to us and redeemed us and brought us from a low place to a far better place. So we invite you this morning to stand with us and to worship our God together. God, it's our prayer that what we've done this time is a joy to you and is honoring you, because you are a God who deserves it. May our words and our thoughts be pleasing in your sight. God, open up our hearts, our minds to your word. May we be changed. And may we become better citizens of you, our King. Through Christ we pray all these things. Before you have a seat, if you want to greet someone around you, there's a question that you could ask them if you would like. If you are under 5 something, you can leave. There you go. Okay. So, I don't know if you've been on Facebook lately, but it's a bit of a disaster.
Between politics and religion and sports, it's hard to find much positive on the Facebook. And I hear Twitter's worse, but that's too fancy for me. But every once in a while, as you're scrolling through something, you find that one thing that keeps you coming back. One of those feel-good stories that just make you smile, right? You know the ones I'm talking about. In this world full of just terrible things, it's nice to hear a story that kind of lifts your spirit, even if for a little bit. And sadly, however, more often than not, most of these stories are about animals that treat humans better than we treat one another. For example, here's a video of a donkey's reaction to seeing a girl who raised him.
that will end the sermon. Just go be like the donkey.
All right, good time. The situation I'm talking about with, the Facebook being a mess reminds me a bit of the Bible. We talked about Judges last week, and if that's not a cesspool fit for Facebook, I don't know what is. And though we really like the stories of the Judges, your Samsons, your Deborahs, your Ehuds, and more, and they're complete with heroes and villains, the reality is that those fun stories often overshadow a very terrible reality. In just a few hundred years, the Israelites had destroyed God's vision for who they would be as a people. And the book ends with some pretty horrifying tales. It paints a picture of what happens when people remove themselves from the lordship of God and they do whatever they want. In fact, the last verse of Judges sums it up. It says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. They actually were supposed to have a king, and that king was God. But when they kicked God off the throne, they were left to their own devices, and things did not go well. They did not have a king, and the result, murder and rape and fighting among brothers and sisters. It was a disaster. And we need one of those feel-good stories so that we don't spiral down into complete hopelessness. And so enter the story of Ruth. It's one of those feel-good stories that we find in the midst of such awfulness. Ruth is our excited donkey, if you will. And the story begins with a very important note about the setting of Ruth. It says, in the days when judges ruled. And the author makes it clear that everything that comes next takes place in that setting. The setting of such degradation and sin is countered with something completely different. A story of redemption and faithfulness. And so I just want to walk through the story quickly and then bring out some application. But for those of you who have ADD in our midst, here's a video summary.
There was a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi who lived in Israel during the time when the judges were in charge. There was a great shortage of food in Israel that caused them to move to a foreign country called Moab. Elimelech and Naomi raised 2 sons, and when their sons grew up, they each married women from Moab. Sadly, Naomi's husband and 2 sons died, and Naomi was left alone with her 2 daughters-in-law. She told them that she was going to move back to Israel, and that they should return to their own families. But one of the women, Ruth, refused to leave Naomi. She said, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So Naomi and Ruth moved back to Israel to begin a new life. One day, Ruth went to a field to pick up the grain that the farmers had left behind. Little did she know that the owner of the field was Boaz, a relative of Naomi. Boaz was kind to her and offered her to come find food whenever she wanted. Naomi was getting older, so she came up with a plan to provide for Ruth once she was gone. She suggested that Ruth sneak into Boaz's bedroom while he was sleeping, uncover his feet, and ask him to take care of her. Ruth took Naomi's advice. She uncovered Boaz's feet and lay down next to him. In the middle of the night, Boaz woke up startled. Ruth asked him to care for and protect her. Boaz agreed, but said he needed to first buy the land she lived on so that he would have the right to marry her. So Boaz brought together the decision makers of his town and asked for permission to buy the land. The leaders gave Boaz permission and prayed that God would help Ruth be a great wife. They were married and had a son named Obed, who would soon become the grandfather of one of the greatest leaders Israel had ever known.
Okay.
There you go. Now, imagine with me for a second that a husband, he comes home from work and he's abnormally quiet. His wife tries to talk to him, but he just sits there in silence. He turns on the TV, but he's not really watching the TV. Later that night, in bed, he sighs and finally says, I was fired today. His wife tries to console him, saying, it's going to be okay. Things will turn around. We'll get through this. 6 months later, they've downsized to an apartment, sold their cars, and depleted their savings. Fast forward 2 years later, Their whole life has changed. No one is hiring in this economy. They're barely making it and on the verge of living in the streets. Instead of worrying what they used to worry about, like where they're going to go out to eat, now they're just wondering where their next meal is going to come from. What are their boys going to eat? Their evening prayers are muffled by the sound of grumbling stomachs. And so they have a decision to make. They can't stay there. They need to move, to leave everything they know and everything they've built to start over. That's what Naomi and her husband experienced. The famine hit, and they left the promised land, and they moved. Now we think, okay, it's no big deal, like they moved, right? But we need to fully grasp the sacrifice they're making. They're leaving this promised land, the land God gave to them. They're leaving behind the land that their family inherited. Back in Joshua, when the land was divided, each of the families received a plot. It was their identity. It was their future. And they were leaving all of that behind. This was the last resort for them. As they moved to Moab, Moab was just across the Dead Sea. And if you know your Israelite history, you know the Moabites were descendants from Lot, from incestuous relationship. That's a fun Sunday school story for the kids. During the time of the Judges, the Moabites actually oppressed the Israelites. And so this group of people are sworn enemies of the Israelites, but they had food. And so if you're Naomi and you're Elimelech, you swallow your pride and you just move there. After settling there, things seemed to go okay. The boys found wives, and perhaps things were fine, until tragedy struck again. Life didn't get any easier for Naomi. Her husband, Elimelech, died. Now she's a widow living in a hostile environment. Her sons die as well, and there's no one left to care for her. And so with nothing left there in Moab, she decided to head home with her daughters-in-law. I'd like to read the dialogue between Naomi and the two young ladies, and the conversation is found in Ruth 1, verses 8 through 18. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you and to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters. It has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. You know, this is a very emotionally charged scene. What Naomi said makes sense. Go back home. Return to your families. They will take care of you and provide for you because I can't. And maybe since you're young, you'll remarry. And with tears, we see that Orpah leaves Naomi. And we know what happens to her, right? She heads home, she starts a TV show, becomes a billionaire, and now she has her own cable channel. Oh, wait. It's Oprah, not Orpah. See? You got to read closely. We don't know what happens to Orpah. She leaves. We don't really care because Ruth stays. There's a very powerful line found in this conversation, a line that illustrates devotion and love and a commitment to stay. And the line reads this: "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." This is an oath, pledging not to go anywhere. Ruth will stay with Naomi through thick and thin and live out her life alongside Naomi. It's hard to really convey what an amazing sacrifice this was. She's breaking with her family, with her country, even with her faith. And I love that phrase, "Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people." She was saying that she would cherish them, identify with them, be devoted to them, live and die with them. So Ruth joining Naomi is a pretty big deal. Just like it was a pretty big deal for Naomi to leave Israel, to settle in Moab as an outsider. Now Ruth is doing the same thing. She's heading to a new place as an outsider. She has no clue what lies ahead. I mean, will she be rejected her whole life for being a Moabitess? Will they even make it there? Will they die on the way? Will they starve? It's a big risk for her. But she wasn't going anywhere. And so they returned to Bethlehem, and the whole town is stirred up. The population of Bethlehem during that time was probably around 200 people. So literally, everyone was talking about her. And they returned, they started calling Naomi by her name. She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Naomi means pleasant in Hebrew, but Mara means bitter. She says her life has been anything but pleasant, and she wants her name to reflect the pain she has endured. As we've seen, Ruth and Naomi, they don't have men in their lives to work the land for them, so they participate in an Israelite custom called gleaning. In Torah, there were instructions to take care of the poor and the widows. And one of the ways this happened was through the process of gleaning, where the harvesters leave some grain and the poor could collect it for themselves. And so Ruth gleans. Now, again, not the safest thing for her to do. A Moabite woman in an Israelite field is risky. A single woman, a single foreign woman would have had a target on her back. She easily could have been taken advantage of. And while she's in the field, Boaz takes notice of her. He wonders who she is. He finds out who she is. And he says, don't glean anywhere else. Glean in my field. Drink water with my servants. He cares for her, protects her. And this is huge. He's extending a hand of acceptance to Ruth. It's an offer of protection. As long as she is in his field, no one will lay a finger on her. And at this, Ruth is humbled, and she bows with her face to the ground. You know, look at Boaz, and you see a man who's noble, who's doing an honorable thing. He didn't have to take care of Ruth. He didn't have to show her overwhelming kindness, but in doing so, he's communicating to Ruth that she is, in fact, accepted. Ruth gleaned, she threshed, she returned home with ample food, and she tells the story to Naomi. And as she's explaining the events of the day, she names Boaz as the guy. And this is when the wheels start turning in Naomi's mind. Naomi goes into full matchmaker mode. Did you say Boaz? Oh, he's a relative. He's a kinsman redeemer. Here's how kinsman redeemer works. If a man dies with an heir that's a close relative, he must marry the widow. So basically you have brothers. If one dies, the other brother marries the widow, buys back the land, loves her, welcomes her, redeems her. And then when those two have a son, that son becomes an heir and full right to the land of the dead brother. It belongs to him, not his father. And remember, the land is part of their identity. So each family had a plot of land. And if a woman didn't have a husband or sons, that land was often sold because the wife couldn't maintain it. And so a kinsman redeemer is marrying the widow. He's producing an heir so that that dead man's name would continue. And that land would stay in that family. And so Naomi, she swings into full matchmaker mode. Go take a shower, get prettied up, get those fancy nails on, get some perfume. What are those fancy nails called? I don't know. No one? Acrylics. Thanks, Madeline. Acrylics. The amount of disdain in that one word is... So she puts acrylics on. I don't know. And she strategically waits until Boaz is in good spirits. He says, go communicate your desire to make him your kinsman redeemer. It seems like an odd custom, but it was very appropriate for the time period. And we have to realize that Ruth is taking another very big risk. She's a Moabitess. She could easily have been rejected. But Boaz, a man of integrity and honor, married her, redeemed her. Boaz accepted her, and eventually she gives birth to a child, and everyone celebrates. Now, that's the short version. There are a lot of other elements in this, to be sure. That's the gist of it. And despite some of the weird cultural things that take place, it's a nice story. It's heartwarming. It's a nice change of pace from the idolatry and the terrible things found in Judges. God's chosen ones looked more like a reality show gone wrong than a holy beacon of hope. They'd abandoned God's plan, again, and had become moral misfits and spiritual adulterers. The light had gone out on God's people. And then a foreigner stepped onto the stage, and a candle of hope flickered once again. The story of Ruth is a diamond in the rough that glimmers against the backdrop of blackness. And that glimmer is the reflection of an ideal that we see throughout Scripture. That ideal is in one Hebrew word, chesed. I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to say, chesed. If they didn't spit on you, they didn't do it right. Chesed is a very guttural word, and the phlegminess is just a natural result. Chesed is one of those words that is not easily translated from one language to another. A lot of our translations will use something like love or steadfast love or faithfulness. But those don't get fully the richness of this word. It has to do with complete faithfulness to a covenant. That no matter what happens, you will keep the high expectations of the agreement you entered into. It's what keeps married couples together, despite rough times that make you just want to get a divorce because that would be easier. It's what keeps people who are part of the body of Christ continuing to love and work through issues with one another when it'd be much easier to leave and find another church where you can just be anonymous. It is the expectation of Jesus for everyone who calls themselves a Christian, those who daily take up their cross and follow him. It is the ideal for all who put themselves under the lordship of God. That's chesed. Put that into a translation, if you will. But it was put on full display in the story of Ruth. In this story, we see the way that creation is supposed to work according to chesed. Ruth and Boaz are held up these models of faithful living, as those who live out chesed in stark contrast to the stories found in Judges. But if you read through it, Ruth and Boaz are also contrasted with two other people, though subtly. Orpah is not actually criticized for her choice to return home, but it is clear that she does not display the same remarkable character that Ruth does. Orpah does the expected and the common response to such a situation. She does what most of us would do, what most people would do. In the same way, this unnamed near redeemer is not overly critiqued. But Boaz's actions are heralded as the appropriate standard. This unnamed man chose to protect his home and his inheritance rather than protect Ruth. So neither Orpah nor this kinsman redeemer are called out for being in the wrong. They're just not equal to the extraordinary demands of chesed. And the story displays the impact of right living and the blessings that follow from it. The characters are commended and they're rewarded for a lifestyle that takes one another's well-being into account. You know, as you look to this story, part of what it means to live according to this standard of chesed is that you are an inclusive community. Ruth is depicted as the Moabitess over and over again. In fact, whenever it says, it's usually Ruth the Moabitess. Not Ruth, Ruth the Moabitess, over and over throughout this book. And she's not an actual Israelite even up to the end of the book. And so for the original readers, every use of the word Moabite would probably cause a pang of a little bit of anger and hostility. Like OSU fan. That's right. And yet, as a result of her confession and her desire to follow Naomi, Ruth ends up marrying Boaz. She becomes included into the nation of Israel, even the lineage of King David. And perhaps the author wants to remind the reader that Ruth, a foreigner, was accepted into Israelite society despite her ethnicity. You know, Ruth should have followed Orpah's example and returned home to her own people. She would have been assured of being cared for and accepted. But she chose instead to support Naomi. She chose the possibility of being ostracized because of her nationality, relegated to a second-class citizen because of her gender, ignored because of her widowed state. That's what she chose. And that faithful choice led to her redemption and the redemption of Naomi's line. The redemption, the restoration that are bestowed upon the seeming outsider. It reminds us of the riches of the kingdom of God that are available to all of us. This is the picture of the church. As a community, we as a church, we make the same promise. God, you will be our God, and your people will be our people. That's what it means to be part of the church. But we don't always experience that, do we? Our world definitely does not experience that. Each of us know people who are outsiders. Some of us here may feel like outsiders. They feel rejected, ignored, reduced to a label. But Christ has broken down all of those walls, those labels, those things that separate us. As people who have received this acceptance, we are called to extend the same. Because God welcomed us into his family, we extend that invitation to others to be welcomed. God welcomes all. He loves all. He forgives. It's such a vital lesson to learn from this story. Ruth, an outsider, was fully accepted into the family of God. It's a message our world desperately needs to hear. In spite of gender or race or any other label that separates and divides humanity, God still pours out his grace upon all of humanity, ideally through the work of the church in the world. And Ruth portrays this ideal story of people who desire to contribute to the community despite any obstacles that come in their way. And Ruth's character provides an example of a resourceful woman who seeks the restoration of the various people in her own life. Ruth challenges us to see where is the Hesed of God breaking in, sometimes in unexpected places and unexpected people. But more than that, Ruth paints the picture of the way community should be, filled with faithful people, serving and caring for each other, as God redeems our hopelessness and our futility, and he produces everlasting results. Would you pray with me? God, it is my prayer that this church, that your church across the world reflects the characteristics of Chesed to one another and to you. May we be the kind of places that are accepting and encouraging and redeeming. May we offset the terrible things that are in this world. Challenge us to be the Ruth in this world to people who desperately need it, who bear with people through thick and thin, through difficult times, out of love and faithfulness to them. Thank you for your Son, who showed us the ultimate example of what faithfulness is. Through Christ we pray all these things. Amen.
Of course. Gotta go for it. Well, welcome this morning. We're glad you were here for our Sunday outreach service. If you're new with us or just can't seem to remember how we do things, this is a little part of how we do church together. The bigger part is in our homes in what we call branch meetings. There's one after this service, one Wednesday night and one Thursday night, as well as all kinds of times throughout the week that we get together. You might notice we didn't do communion, not much in-depth prayer time, that kind of stuff. That happens in the homes. And that's where we really share life together. So we really encourage you to get plugged into one of those branches. This is kind of a close it up, give announcements time. I know we have a very exciting alumni/student soccer game on Saturday, I hear. There's even talk of possible cotton candy. Things are very excited. So, I know a lot of you are alumni, so and some are even planning on joining that festivity. Yes? Yes, I'm seeing some nods, and there's ones back there. So, when is that? Do we know? 2:30 Saturday at the soccer field. Probably picked that part up. Any other announcements that we have for the group? All right. Something's a few weeks away, apparently. Hope we'll tell you more about that if you want to know about it. And
Sunday school.
Oh, Sunday school, formerly TNT, formerly I don't know what else is going to be starting back up in 2 weeks-ish. So look forward to that. Probably a more complete announcement about that, say, next week. Steve, come on up.
I know a lot of people here, but a lot of people don't know me. Steve, as you while ago. I moved away, and it's just wonderful to be back today. I wanted to thank, some of you may not know this, but the fellowship gave me a large sum of money recently, and I really wanted to thank everybody for that. It was about 8 years ago that kind of tragedy hit my life, and things have come full circle, and out of some need, your fellowship showed a great amount of love towards me. A lot of what Sam said today about love extending to people who don't belong or don't seem like they belong to you, that your act of kindness and love really meant a lot to me. One of my favorite psalms that continued to keep coming back to me and came back to me this day. I'll share it on my iPhone because most of us can't. It's Psalm 133, and it goes like this. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers and sisters, a little rapid there, to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious oil upon the head coming down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard, coming down upon the edge of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon coming down upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, life forever. And life forever is experienced within the fellowship, within the fellowship of one another, brothers and sisters that love the Lord and extend that love towards others. So, just want to thank everyone for your love that has changed my life and has given me hope. And it's just great to see the brothers and sisters once again. Thank you so much for everything. Please don't. I do want to say something that I've been away for a while, so there's probably been times that I've maybe offended people or I've done things wrong or something. I just want to apologize for that. Sometimes I'm a little crazy and I do sinful things, and I hate me for it, and I hate that in me, but I know that God loves me and you guys love me through Him, and I appreciate that. And if I have offended you and you need to talk to me about that, I'd be more than happy to receive that love and forgiveness. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd say there's lots of us that could make that same speech at the end, at least. We've messed up and need to fix things. So if that's you, take that chance today. Take Steve's lead and patch things. If you're new with us and haven't had a chance to yet, we have a little hospitality booth back in the back with mugs and chocolate and things. We'd love to share that with you and answer more questions about how we do the kingdom together here. And if you haven't had a chance, we like to eat together a lot, so there'll be somebody that would love to take you out for lunch and spend time with you. Do we have a designated person for that today? I'm sure we do. It's Larry, and he's back there. How convenient. Anything else before we take off? Oh.
We don't have anything big planned, but Shelby's 16th birthday is Friday.
16 on Friday. Yeah. Way to embarrass your kid, Mom. Well, cool. That's it then. So you're dismissed.
Tacos. Yeah, because my mom was like, it's too hot to have chicken.